Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall glass windows of the Okafor estate, casting streaks of gold across the marble floors. Adrien Okafor sat at the far end of the expansive living room, his laptop open on the glass table, his eyes darting between financial graphs and incoming emails. His empire stretched across oil, real estate, and tech, each demanding his constant attention. He had never been the type to indulge in small talk or unnecessary visits, especially with his mother, whose constant interference in his personal life was an old battlefield between them. But when Mama Ifeoma entered, leaning slightly on her cane, yet holding herself with the poise of a queen, Adrien could tell by the firmness in her eyes that this was no casual conversation. She settled into the chair opposite him, the faint aroma of her lavender perfume filling the air, and after a moment of silence, she said in a tone that brooked no argument, "Adrien, before I leave this earth, I want to see you married. I want to meet your wife and know that you are settled." He blinked, setting aside his laptop. This wasn't the first time she'd mentioned marriage, but the weight in her voice made something in him pause. He tried to laugh it off, murmuring something about being too busy, but she didn't smile. She pressed a hand against her chest, as if steadying her heartbeat, and he noticed how pale she looked under the soft light. "My heart is not what it used to be," she admitted quietly. "I want to see you with someone who will care for you when I no longer can. Promise me you will not let me leave this world without that peace." Adrien leaned back, irritation pricking at the edges of his mind, but alongside it was a thin thread of unease. Mama Ifeoma was not a woman given to melodrama. If she said her health was failing, it was serious. Still, marriage had never been part of his blueprint for success. Women were distractions, and marriage was a contract that cost more than it ever paid in emotional returns. He had worked too hard to get to the top of Nigeria's business elite to risk entanglement in a relationship that could crumble under public scrutiny or manipulation. Yet, as she sat there watching him, her once strong features softened by age and illness, he realized this wasn't about him. It was about her peace of mind. A part of him wanted to argue, to explain that love and domestic life didn't fit into his carefully calculated schedule. But another part remembered her sacrifices. The nights she worked 3 jobs after his father's death, the times she sold her jewelry to pay his school fees, the way she had raised him to command a room. Could he really deny her this one wish, even if it meant bending his own rules? After a long silence, he told her he would think about it. That was enough to make her smile faintly, though she gave him a knowing look that said she expected more than vague promises. When she left the room, Adrien remained in his seat, staring out at the vast lawns of the estate. The sound of her cane tapping on the polished floors echoed in his ears long after she disappeared from sight. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There were women he had dated, beautiful, accomplished, and perfectly capable of playing the role his mother wanted, but none he trusted to keep things discreet. None who wouldn't use the opportunity to angle for his fortune or cement a permanent place in his life. He thought about how quickly his mother's health seemed to be deteriorating and realized that time was not on his side. If he was going to do this, it had to be fast, seamless, and without complications. And if there was one thing Adrien knew, it was how to close a deal on his own terms, even if the deal this time involved pretending to be in love. By the next morning, Adrien's mind was already working like a well-oiled negotiation machine. He needed someone convincing enough to fool Mama Ifeoma, but invisible enough to avoid the radar of Lagos gossip circles. The idea of hiring an actress briefly crossed his mind, professional, trained, able to memorize a fabricated love story with ease, but he quickly dismissed it. Actresses came with managers, publicity headaches, and an appetite for exposure. He needed someone who wouldn't speak to the press, someone whose existence could be shaped entirely by his rules. His personal assistant, Bode, suggested a few acquaintances, quiet socialites, businesswomen with clean reputations, but each name came with potential drawbacks. Adrien was about to close the conversation when something small yet vivid interrupted his thoughts. The previous evening, as he walked through the staff quarters to check on a renovation. He had noticed one of the maids kneeling beside his sick Labrador, Max. She was stroking the dog's head with gentle persistence, whispering in soft Igbo as she coaxed him to eat. Max, who barely tolerated anyone but Adrien, had rested his head on her lap as if comforted. That image had stuck with him. Her name was Chinello. He remembered it because he had overheard another maid calling out to her. She was in her mid-20s, slim, with skin the shade of warm mahogany and eyes that seemed far too expressive for her quiet role in the household. From what little Adrien had noticed over the years, she kept to herself, spoke respectfully, and worked without fuss. In a world where ambition often came laced with manipulation, Chinello seemed untouched by that hunger. She didn't flirt with the drivers for favors, didn't linger in the kitchen to eavesdrop on conversations, and never sought to be noticed by him. And perhaps that was what made her suddenly perfect for this arrangement, her invisibility. If she could handle pretending to be his wife without drawing suspicion, it could be the cleanest solution to his problem. That afternoon, Adrien had Bode discreetly look into her background. The report was sparse, no scandals, no hidden relationships, no ties to the media. Her only notable complication was financial. A younger brother in the hospital awaiting surgery, the bills climbing beyond what she could pay. That piece of information locked the deal in Adrien's mind. If she was desperate for money, she would agree, and if she agreed, she would follow the rules without complaint. He decided to summon her to his private study the next day. This wasn't going to be a request, it would be a business proposition. She would act the part, receive a generous payout, and they would part ways cleanly when the time came. Adrien believed he had thought through every angle, but what he didn't know was that the moment he opened this door, his carefully controlled life would never be the same. Chinello stepped into the study with the cautious posture of someone who had never been summoned there before. The room was an imposing blend of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the faint scent of Adrien's cologne. She stood near the door, unsure if she should take a seat, until Adrien gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Sit," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. She perched on the edge of the seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes lowered. For a moment, Adrien simply observed her, her plain, well-pressed uniform, the calloused fingers that spoke of years of work, the barely concealed fatigue in her face. Then he leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "I have a proposition for you," he began, "one that could solve your current financial problem." Her eyes lifted in confusion, and he continued before she could ask. "I need you to pretend to be my wife for the next 3 months. In exchange, I will pay you 5 million naira, enough to cover your brother's surgery and more." The words hung in the air like a dare. Chinello's brows knit together, the shock plain on her face. "Pretend to be your wife," she repeated slowly, as if tasting the absurdity. She shook her head almost immediately. "Sir, I can't. It's dishonest. And your mother." She stopped herself before speaking too freely. Adrien's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of his mother, but he kept his voice even. "This isn't about dishonesty. It's about giving my mother peace while she recovers. You don't have to love me. You just have to play a role." Chinello opened her mouth to refuse again, but the mention of her brother tugged sharply at her conscience. She had spent weeks begging, borrowing, and stretching every coin to keep him in the hospital. The thought of him being turned away for lack of funds felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Silence stretched between them until Adrien slid a small envelope across the desk. "This is an advance," he said. "It's yours if you agree right now. The rest comes when the arrangement ends." Chinello stared at the envelope, knowing it could change everything. The weight of responsibility for her brother pressed against her shoulders like a physical force. She thought of the bills piling up, the nurses' sympathetic but firm warnings, and the fact that she had no other way to raise the money in time. Slowly, she reached out and took the envelope, her fingers trembling. 3 months, she said quietly. "And when it's over, I walk away." Adrien's lips curved in the faintest smile, not of warmth, but of a man sealing a deal. 3 months, he confirmed. Neither of them realized that the clock they had just started would count down to far more than the end of a contract, It would count down to the reshaping of both their lives. The morning the transformation began, the mansion's private wing felt like a backstage corridor before a grand performance. Lights bright, voices hushed with urgency, fabrics swishing as garment bags were unzipped and hung in a neat gradient from cream to midnight blue. Chinello stood at the threshold of Adrien's walk-in wardrobe, her palms damp, watching two stylists glide like practice dancers between mirrored islands. The lead stylist, a crisp-spoken woman named Zuri, with a tape measure looped around her neck like a necklace of authority, sized Chinello up in a glance and murmured for a measuring kit. "We'll build elegance around what is already dignified," she announced, and for a brief moment, Chinello felt seen. Seen not as a maid or a placeholder in a billionaire's life, but as a woman who could carry a different skin. The measuring began. Bust, waist, hips, shoulder slope, inseam, the quiet arithmetic of reinvention. Shoes lined up like a chorus. Kitten heels for daytime poise, stilettos for evening dazzle, soft leather flats for private hours when feet begged for mercy. Across the room, a makeup artist tested shades along Chinello's jawline, each swatch a question. What does power look like on your face? The mirror offered an answer she hardly recognized. Beneath the careful grooming, her own eyes remained steady and questioning, as if to ask whether the price of beauty would be counted solely in naira or in the slow erosion of self. The etiquette lessons were less forgiving than the fabrics. A retired diplomat's wife, Madame Sulaco, arrived just after noon, carrying a slim binder and the unhurried certainty of someone who has never had to rush for a bus. "Posture," she said gently, tapping Chinello's shoulder blades with a pencil. "Spine tall as a palm tree. Chin forward, yet not proud. If you lean too far back, you look aloof. Too far forward, you look desperate. Balance is the grammar of dignity." Balance also proved to be the grammar of pain. By the third hour, Chinello's calves trembled from heel drills, and her cheeks ached from practicing a smile described as warm, not wide. Silverware lessons came next, which fork for the salad, which knife for fish, where to rest a napkin between bites, how to tilt a soup bowl away instead of toward. When she finally sat for a mock lunch, a tiny round of goat cheese, a smoked fish fillet, a green salad that gleamed like dewy grass, she felt like a counterfeit queen at a borrowed table, terrified that one wrong gesture would send the illusion crashing. Yet in the tension, there were flickers of triumph. The way her hand steadied on the champagne flute after a dozen awkward tries, the moment Madame Sulaco nodded, satisfied, as Chinello navigated cutlery without clatter. Every small win stitched another thread into the costume she would have to wear before Mama Ifioma, except this costume required not only fabric, but breath and borrowed nerve. Adrien watched the process with a broker's detachment that cracked only in private, when no one saw him pacing the corridor outside the music room where Chinello rehearsed introductions. He told himself the investment was necessary. His mother deserved a performance as flawless as the marble his money could buy. But there were moments, unwanted, insistent, when he noticed something that could not be purchased, the concentration that gathered behind Chinello's eyes like morning light, the way she reached for dignity rather than decoration, the silent refusal to let anyone rearrange her soul even as they rearranged her clothes. Friction found them anyway. When he criticized her posture for the third time that evening, she set the practice teacup down with more force than etiquette allowed and said, "I can learn the steps, sir, but I won't become your puppet." The word startled him, the first open defiance since the contract began, and yet unexpectedly, he respected her more for saying it. He lowered his voice. "I don't want a puppet," he lied or half-lied. "I want conviction." She lifted her chin. Conviction comes from truth. They regarded one another like two cautious travelers on opposite banks of a river neither had planned to cross. Then the moment broke. Zuri called for a final fitting. Madame Sulaco adjusted a cuff, and the river flowed on, cold, clear, waiting. By dusk, the house fell quiet. In her private room, Chinello removed the borrowed elegance piece by piece, folded it carefully, and stood barefoot by the window, whispering a prayer for her brother, for vision, for courage enough to survive the lie, without losing the person she still recognized when the mirror was empty of everyone else's hands. The day of the introduction arrived wrapped in harmattan clarity, the sky a pale sheet, the air tasting faintly of dust and distance. Adrien had chosen the garden pavilion behind the main house, a place his mother loved for its jacaranda canopy and the fat, inquisitive lizards that basked along the stone balustrade. He'd ordered fresh flowers, but the garden had outperformed the florist. Bougainvilleas spilled in defiant purples along the trellis, and the jacarandas scattered delicate lavender like a quiet blessing over the paving stones. When Mama Ifioma came through the archway, she wore a wrapper the color of ripe mango and a gelly tied with patient strength. She leaned on her cane, but did not seem frail. Rather, she moved with the unspoken authority of someone who had balanced grief and bills and a boy with a head full of thunder. "My son," she said, and Adrien's shoulders, squared by habit, softened by instinct. He guided her to the cushioned bench, his hand light on her elbow, then turned toward the entrance where Chinello waited just out of sight, the final seconds before a curtain rose. Chinello stepped forward, and for a heartbeat, the world paused to take its bearings. She wore a simple ankle-length dress the color of morning tea, a string of freshwater pearls settling at the base of her throat like breath finding home. Zuri had insisted on subtlety. Let the dignity in her do the talking, she'd said, and the choice proved wise. Chinello's hair was swept into a low chignon. A few soft curls had the audacity to escape and frame her face with an honesty no brush could bully away. She greeted Mama Ifioma with both hands the old-fashioned way, and sank into a respectful half-curtsy that belonged to no manual, only to memory and upbringing. "Good afternoon, Ma," she said, her voice a low, steady river. "I am Chinello." The older woman's eyes, a keen, assessing brown, studied Chinello's face, then her hands, then the quiet firmness of her posture. "Chinello," she repeated, tasting the name. "Welcome. Sit, my daughter." The word, daughter, slipped out as naturally as breeze and landed in Chinello's chest like a lit candle. She felt its warmth rise to her face and forced herself to breathe through it as she sat on the bench's edge, back straight, palms open on her knees as Madame Sulaco had drilled, but heart entirely uncoached. Conversation, that skittish animal, began with small tame steps. Mama Ifioma asked about the drive, the weather, the ridiculousness of Lagos traffic, which made them all laugh with a little too much relief. Then the questions deepened, not prying and aristocratic, but maternal and precise. What food did Chinello cook for herself when she needed comfort? Did she prefer morning walks or evening ones? Which hymns had carried her through difficult seasons? Each answer knitted another thread between them. When Chinello admitted, shyly, that she loved to garden because plants don't hurry, they simply trust the sun, Mama Ifioma nodded with a satisfaction that looked like recognition across time. At one point, a nurse came to remind Mama of her afternoon medication, and the tray rattled. Without thinking, Chinello reached out, steadying the glass before a spill could embarrass anyone. The gesture cost nothing and meant everything. Adrien watched the exchange from his chair, silent in a way that was rare for him. Silence had never earned him a contract, never bent a boardroom to his will. But here in the small republic of his mother's smile, he found himself hoping the lie would land softly enough not to bruise the truth blossoming under it. When the visit ended, Mama Ifioma clasped Chinello's hands again. "You have gentle strength," she said. "This family needs that." Later, as the garden fell quiet and the jacaranda offered its evening sigh, Adrien walked Chinello back toward the house. "You were good," he said, struggling against the poverty of his vocabulary when it encountered sincerity. She glanced up, eyes steady. "I was myself," she answered. He said nothing, because that was the one quality he had not included in the contract, and the only one that now seemed to matter. If there had been a vote, it would have been unanimous within days. The house ran easier wherever Chinello passed. It wasn't in grand gestures. There were no dramatic reorganizations or scripted acts of benevolence. It was the way the kitchen staff's laughter thinned less by noon when she delivered a thermos of Zobo to the pastry chef who never remembered to drink water. The way Max, whose loyalty could be leased by no one, followed her with contented sighs and slept at her door as if guarding a secret. On the third morning after the garden meeting, Mama Ifioma sent a message through Bode that sounded more like a decree than an invitation. Let the child move into the main house. If she is family, let her live like it. Adrien read the note twice, tasting the irony of his own design. He had imagined proximity as a tool. Now, proximity belonged to his mother's joy. When he came to inform Chinello, he found her in the staff courtyard kneeling beside a cracked clay pot, coaxing a stubborn hibiscus to forgive an overzealous son. "Pack your things," he said without preamble. "Mother wants you in the family wing." She looked up, one hand banded with soil, surprise knifing across her features, followed by something more complicated. Gratitude and dread twined like a double helix. "I don't want to make trouble," she murmured. "Trouble is my job," he replied, softer than he intended. "Yours is to help me give her peace." She nodded, then wiped her hands on a clean rag, the gesture of a person preparing to enter a room where every step matters. Moving into the family wing altered the air she breathed. The corridor smelled faintly of sandalwood and polished wood, and the walls bore photographs not merely of power, but of memory. A young Adrien with missing front teeth holding a plastic trophy above his head. Mama Ifioma in a dress the color of thunderstorms, grinning at a market stall piled high with plantains. A snapshot of a man Chinello recognized from obituary clippings. Adrien's father, standing with one arm around his wife and the other around a much smaller, more breakable world. In her new room, sunlight pooled like gold at the foot of the bed, and a vase of fresh frangipani sat on the dresser, almost too fragrant to be believed. Chinello ran a hand over the bedspread, the expensive cotton cool as river stone, and reminded herself that this was a stage, not a sanctuary. Still, the stage asked for honesty it had no right to demand. She discovered this the first time Mama Ifioma beckoned her to the kitchen and handed her a wooden spoon. "I want to taste the woman my son chose," she said with a smile that held challenge and affection in equal measure. Chinello told herself to keep it simple, then cooked the food that had, for years, whispered survival into her bones. Oaf akwu with ripe plantains and a scatter of scent leaves. Rice cooked till each grain remembered its own name. Fish stewed slowly until the tomatoes lost their need to boast. When Mama tasted the sauce, her eyes closed and her shoulders lowered, as if a memory had walked back into the room and asked to be forgiven. "You cook like a woman who has waited and not grown bitter," she said. "This family will eat well." When the pot emptied, the kitchen staff pretended not to notice the way Adrien refilled his plate, but the news traveled anyway. The madam had a favorite, and the favorite wore humility like a garment the world could not stain. Not everyone set a place at that table. In the corners where true power sulks, when it is denied a seat, whispers gathered like midges near fruit. Adrien's cousin Chuka, who had always preferred mirrors to windows, watched Chinello with the curiosity of a cat eyeing a bird that had flown in the wrong door. He noted the swiftness with which the household fell into orbit around her, the small permissions she did not take but was given, the way Mama invited her to morning devotions and asked her to read the Psalms, the way the housekeeper, who reported to no one but God and the payroll, consulted her on staff rosters, because you see people, not only tasks. Chuka told himself it was all a phase. He told himself that if he peered closely enough, he would find the glitch in the performance, the sudden intake of breath, the wrong word, the lapse in breeding that would betray her. But the more he searched for proof of unworthiness, the more he found proof of something else, a steadiness that could not come from coaching alone. Meanwhile, Chinello learned that favor, even maternal favor, is a delicate cloth. It warms, but it also draws wind. She navigated by a quiet compass. Never speak when silence gives honor. Never be absent when presence offers comfort. Never forget the cost of the ring not yet on her finger, or the hospital bed her brother still occupied. At night, when the house dimmed and the smell of dinner faded into the clean scent of starch sheets, she would kneel and pray, not for escape anymore, but for integrity in the middle of a blessing she had not asked for. Across the hall, Adrien sat at his desk, the weight of his mother's happiness expanding until it pressed against his ribs. He had hired a lie, and yet everywhere he looked, the truth insisted on getting there first. He told himself it was strategic success. Then he looked down at his second helping of oaf akwu, and, without planning to, smiled like a man who had forgotten, briefly, the price of everything. The first bond between Chinelo and Mama Ifioma was not born over food or formalities, but in the slow, unremarkable minutes of an ordinary afternoon. Mama had been reading in her sitting room, the ceiling fan slicing the warm air into lazy spirals, when Chinelo arrived with a tray of hibiscus tea and slices of fresh pawpaw. She did not set the tray down and retreat as most staff might. Instead, she waited until Mama finished her paragraph, then gently placed the cup into her hands. "I thought you might need something cool," she said simply. The gesture was not part of her training, not rehearsed for effect. It came from the reflex of a woman who had learned to notice quiet needs. Mama's eyes softened. "Sit," she said, pointing to the low ottoman beside her chair. And Chinelo sat. At first, the conversation was about nothing: how the jacaranda was blooming early, how the price of beans had gone up again in the market. But soon Mama was asking about Chinelo's childhood. The questions were not sharp, they were stepping stones, each placed gently enough for truth to walk across. Chinelo told her about growing up in Enugu with her mother and younger brother, about her father's early death, and the way grief sometimes tasted like unripe mango, bitter and stubborn in the mouth. She did not mention her work as a maid. She skirted the truth without lying outright, framing her answers to sound like the life of any modest young woman in Lagos. Mama listened with the attentiveness of someone accustomed to reading between lines, yet she did not press harder than Chinelo was willing to go. Instead, she offered her own stories, of being a young wife when Adrien's father died, of making market money stretch until snapped, of swallowing her own tears so her son would not think strength was a luxury. As they spoke, Adrien passed by the open doorway, intending to check on his mother before heading out to a meeting. He slowed when he saw them. Chinelo leaning forward slightly, hands clasped, Mama gesturing with the kind of animation she rarely displayed these days. Their voices were low, but he caught fragments. Sometimes pride is just a heavy coat we wear to keep from shivering. And sometimes love is the only thread that can hold it together. He lingered a moment longer unseen, before moving on, unsettled by a thought he couldn't quite name. He had brought Chinelo into this role to serve his own purpose, but here she was, weaving herself into the fabric of his mother's days without his instruction. That evening, as the sunset smeared gold across the estate's high walls, Mama asked Chinelo to join her for evening prayers. It was a small circle, just the two of them, a worn leather Bible, and the sound of crickets stitching the silence between their words. When they finished, Mama reached over and squeezed Chinelo's hand. "You are not just my son's wife in name," she said softly. "You are my daughter in spirit." The words lodged deep in Chinelo's chest, bittersweet and heavy, because they came wrapped in sincerity she hadn't earned through truth. She smiled and murmured her thanks, but inside she was turning over the reality. Each day she spent in this role was a day she was building a bond on borrowed ground. That night, lying in her bed, she wondered which would hurt more, the day Mama found out the truth, or the day this arrangement ended and she had to leave without saying goodbye. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, a chance for Mama to enjoy an evening without the formality of guests. The long mahogany table gleamed under the light of a chandelier, polished so well it reflected the crystal glasses set at each place. But the moment Amara walked in, draped in a dress that clung like it had been tailored to her ego, the air shifted. Adrien had not invited her. She claimed she was in the neighborhood and decided to stop by, but everyone at the table knew this was a calculated intrusion. Mama's eyebrows arched slightly, but she smiled in polite welcome. Chinelo, seated beside Adrien, offered a small nod of greeting, her hands folding into her lap beneath the tablecloth. From the first course, Amara's remarks came wrapped in sugar and salt. "Chinelo, darling, I hear you've been keeping Adrien company. You must tell me, what do you two talk about all day? I imagine high society can be a bit overwhelming." Her tone dripped with false sympathy, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of striking a bruise she believed existed. Mama Ifioma set down her fork with deliberate care, her gaze shifting to Amara with a calm that was sharper than any raised voice. "Overwhelming," she said lightly. "I find Chinelo has a way of making any room feel comfortable, even this one, when it's disturbed by uninvited tension." The rebuke was so precise it silenced even the quiet scrape of cutlery. Adrien's lips twitched as if he might smirk, but he kept his eyes on his plate, unwilling to ignite a public scene. Chinello felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not entirely from embarrassment, but from the shock of being defended so directly. She murmured a thank you to Mama, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. Amara, unwilling to concede defeat, tried again during the second course. Adrien always did have a taste for unconventional choices. I suppose it's refreshing for him. Her words were aimed like darts, but Mama caught them midair. What's refreshing, she said, is seeing my son smile over a meal again. And that's thanks to Chinello, not you. By dessert, the tension had crystallized into something brittle. Amara excused herself early, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a retreat masked as dignity. When the front door closed behind her, Mama turned to Chinello with an approving nod. Don't let small minds define your worth, she said. They only measure what they understand. Adrien, silent through most of the exchange, finally looked at Chinello as if seeing her through a lens he hadn't considered before. Later that night, when they crossed paths in the hallway, he paused and said quietly, "You handled yourself well." She met his gaze, her voice cool. "I didn't have to. Your mother did it for me." And though her tone was even, the truth in it lingered between them like the aftertaste of something bittersweet. The injury happened in the most ordinary of moments, proof that disruption doesn't always arrive with a warning. Mama had been preparing for a charity event she hosted annually for widows and single mothers, a tradition rooted in her own years of struggle. Chinello was helping arrange donated fabrics when her foot caught on the edge of a rolled carpet. She twisted her ankle, the sharp pain forcing her to sit down abruptly, clutching at the hem of her dress. Adrien, who had come in to discuss logistics with his mother, was beside her before she could wave off concern. "You can't walk on that," he said, kneeling to inspect her ankle. She protested, insisting it was just a minor twist, but he ignored her words and gently pressed around the swelling. His touch was careful, almost hesitant, and she found herself watching the concentration in his face as he worked, brows drawn, lips pressed in a line that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with focus on her. He fetched ice from the kitchen himself, a fact that startled the staff nearly as much as it startled Chinello. Adrien Okafor did not fetch. He placed the ice pack over her ankle and stayed there, timing the compresses, asking if the pain was easing. Mama watched the scene with a small, knowing smile, but said nothing, letting the silence do its work. Chinello, unused to being the center of anyone's unhurried attention, found her defenses wobbling. There was no smirk on his face, no trace of the calculating man who had made her sign a contract. There was only a quiet man holding her comfort as if it mattered. She wanted to tell herself it was just part of keeping up appearances for his mother's sake, but Mama wasn't even in the room now. She had stepped out to make a call. This care was unobserved, unrequired, and therefore unsettling. When the ice pack was replaced with a bandage, Adrien sat back on his heels and looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. It was different from the polite or smug expressions she had catalogued in her mind. This one was unguarded, almost boyish. "You'll live," he said, his tone lighter than she'd ever heard it. She chuckled softly despite herself, the tension between them momentarily disarmed. For a brief, uncalculated heartbeat, their eyes held, not in challenge or transaction, but in something dangerously close to mutual regard. Later, alone in her room, Chinello replayed that moment, the way his smile had reached his eyes, and wondered if it had been real. Across the hall, Adrien closed his laptop without finishing his emails, the echo of her laugh still in his ears. It occurred to him, reluctantly, almost irritably, that for the first time since this arrangement began, he had smiled without meaning to. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous development of all. The first whispers arrived like the dry season wind, thin, sharp, and carrying dust that could irritate the eyes long before it was visible. It began in the velvet-carpeted halls of Lagos's high society events, where people gathered under the pretense of charity and networking, but truly came to trade in currency more valuable than naira: information. Amara, still licking the wounds of her dinner table humiliation, began her campaign subtly. Over glasses of champagne, she would lean toward a fellow socialite and say, "Oh, you've met Adrien's new wife? Fascinating choice, isn't she?" She wouldn't elaborate immediately. Instead, she would let curiosity bloom and then water it with suggestions, never outright lies, but words shaped so carefully they grew into conclusions of their own accord. "I've heard she's from very humble beginnings," she'd murmur, as though humility were a scandal in itself. The phrase was a seed that could sprout in 100 directions depending on the mind that received it. Some imagined provincial families. Others thought of a past draped in whispered shame. Within a week, the murmurs had crossed from drawing rooms to dinner parties, amplified with each retelling. Adrien first became aware of the rumors when an old business associate, during a meeting about a property development, made a joking remark about training the village out of a wife. The words were tossed casually, as though harmless, but they landed on Adrien's ears like grit grinding against polished glass. His jaw tightened, and he cut the meeting short, dismissing it under the guise of another engagement. He didn't confront Amara directly, not yet, because he had no concrete proof linking her to the growing chatter. But suspicion is a living thing, and it began pacing in his mind, wearing grooves into the patience he usually wore like armor. Chinello, for her part, remained unaware at first. She noticed only a subtle change in the way some people looked at her during outings with Mama Ifeoma, eyes lingering a fraction too long, smiles that felt brittle. She told herself it was simply because she was new to this world and carried herself differently than women who had been molded in its rules from birth. Still, the awareness prickled at her skin in quiet moments, when the echo of a stranger's gaze followed her into her dreams. Bode, Adrien's assistant, brought him more concrete news a few days later. "It's Amara," he said, his tone grim. "She's not just talking. She's feeding details. Enough truth to make the lies believable." Adrien stared at him, weighing his options. Publicly, he could shut it down, issue statements, even threaten legal action. But that would drag his mother into the storm, and her health was still fragile. Privately, he could confront Amara, but she would only twist his reaction into more fodder for her narrative. The third option, the one he hated most, was to ignore it and hope it burned itself out. He chose the silence for now, telling himself it was for his mother's sake, though a deeper part of him admitted it was because Chinello was doing so well at winning Mama's trust that he couldn't risk disrupting the balance. As he sat alone in his study that night, a tumbler of whiskey sweating onto the desk beside him, he realized that the rumors weren't just an attack on Chinello, they were a test of his own resolve. And the answer, for now, was to wait and watch. But waiting has a way of sharpening the knives that will eventually be used. It happened on a Sunday evening, the kind of day that began with church bells threading through the morning air, and ended with the smell of jollof rice lingering long after the plates were cleared. Mama Ifeoma had insisted on a small, intimate dinner, just the three of them, followed by tea in her sitting room. Chinello sat beside her on the floral love seat, their knees nearly touching, while Adrien took the armchair opposite, a book in his hand that he wasn't really reading. The conversation drifted from scripture to family traditions to the upcoming charity event, and somewhere in the gentle tide of it, Mama's gaze grew sharper. She set her teacup down with care and said, "Chinello, does my son truly love you?" The question landed without warning, like a sudden change in weather, and for a heartbeat, Chinello forgot how to breathe. Her mind raced. The truth, raw and bare, would hurt Mama in ways she could not undo. Yet lying felt like pressing a knife against her own conscience. She looked down at her hands, fingers curling slightly against her knees. "Yes, Mama," she said softly, and the words felt like both a shield and a chain. Mama's face relaxed into a smile, the kind that deepened the lines at the corners of her eyes, and she reached for Chinello's hand. "Good," she murmured, "because you have given me peace I have not felt in years." Chinello managed to return the smile, but her chest was tight, the weight of her answer pressing against her ribs. She risked a glance at Adrien, who was watching her with an unreadable expression, part curiosity, part something softer, but still restrained. Later, when Mama retired to her room, Adrien followed Chinello into the hallway. "You didn't have to say that," he said quietly, his tone more observation than accusation. "I know," she replied, but she needed to hear it. For a moment they stood in the dim light, the air between them charged with something neither was ready to name. "Thank you," he said finally, and the sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "For protecting her." She nodded, then turned to leave, but he reached out, his fingers brushing her wrist. It wasn't a grip, just a touch, but it held her still. "Chinello," he began, and there was a flicker in his eyes, as if he might say something unguarded. But the moment broke when Bode appeared at the end of the hall with a file in hand. Adrien stepped back, his face shuddering again. Chinello walked away, her pulse unsteady, wondering what he had been about to confess, and why the thought of it left her both unsettled and strangely expectant. Suspicion, once planted, is a persistent weed. It grows in corners you don't even realize have cracks. Chuka, Adrien's cousin, had never fully accepted Chinello's place in the household. He told himself it was about protecting family honor, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't stand being upstaged in Mama's eyes. Her open affection for Chinello grated against his pride, and the more she praised her, the more determined he became to find something, anything, that would tarnish her in Mama's view. It began with small inquiries, slipped into casual conversations with staff. Where is she from? What did she do before she came here? The answers were vague, which only fueled his curiosity. Eventually, he reached out to a private investigator he'd used before for less noble purposes, instructing him to dig into Chinello's background quietly, with no trace leading back to him. The investigator's report came back quicker than expected, a slim file thick with implication. Chinello's employment records confirmed what Chuka had suspected. She was indeed a maid before this sudden elevation into wifehood. There were no criminal records, no scandals, nothing overtly damaging, but for someone like Mama, who prized transparency and tradition, the revelation could be enough to plant out. Chuka imagined presenting the information at just the right moment, watching the light in Mama's eyes dim. Yet as he flipped through the pages, he hesitated. Mama's health was fragile. Any shock could undo the progress she'd made since Chinello entered their lives. There was also the matter of Adrien. Whatever Chuka thought of him, he knew his cousin's temper, and using this knowledge too carelessly could backfire in ways he couldn't control. For now, Chuka decided to keep the information to himself, storing it like a weapon in a locked chest, waiting for the right battle. But the act of knowing changed him. His glances toward Chinello became sharper, his small talk edged with an unspoken challenge, as if daring her to slip up. Chinello sensed it, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere whenever he entered the room. She told herself it didn't matter. She had survived worse than suspicion. But in quiet moments, when she caught him watching her with that calculating look, she felt the walls of her borrowed world inching closer. Somewhere deep down, she knew this truth, when it emerged, would not simply end the arrangement. It would test the very bond she'd formed with Mama. And if that bond broke, she wasn't sure she'd survive the loss. It began subtly, a longer pause between Mama Ifeoma's sentences during breakfast, a faint hesitation when she rose from her chair, the way her hand sometimes drifted to her chest, as though pressing down an ache she didn't want to name. Chinello noticed first. She had grown accustomed to watching Mama's movements the way one watches a child learning to walk, alert to every imbalance, every falter. One late afternoon, as the garden cast long shadows and the jacaranda shed lavender petals onto the walkway, Mama leaned against the wrought iron bench after only a few steps. Her face paled beneath her gelly, and for a moment she closed her eyes. "I just need breath," she murmured when Chinello knelt beside her, concern etched deep. But it was not just breath she needed. Her pulse felt faint under Chinello's fingers. She called for the driver, her voice steady despite the drumbeat of fear in her chest. They got her into the car, Mama protesting that it was just tiredness, but Chinello could hear the slight tremor in her words. By the time they reached the hospital, Adrien was already pacing the lobby, his phone still in his hand, as though he'd been making calls even as he rushed there. He caught Chinello's gaze, and for a moment, no words passed between them, just the silent acknowledgement of shared fear. Hospital corridors have a way of shrinking the world to its bare bones, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, antiseptic air stripping away the perfume of gardens and wealth, reducing everyone to patient and witness. Chinello sat beside Mama's bed while doctors ran tests, holding her hand between both of hers. Mama's breathing evened out under the oxygen tube, but the paleness of her face seemed starker against the hospital sheets. She looked smaller, as though the illness had folded her in on herself. Adrien stood at the foot of the bed, his expression tightly controlled, but Chinello saw the way his knuckles whitened around the bed frame. She spoke softly to Mama, telling her stories from her childhood, safe stories, the ones that carried no shadow of the truth she was hiding. Mama smiled faintly at some, her eyes opening and closing with slow deliberation, as if weighing whether to stay in this world or drift into another. The doctors explained that her heart needed careful monitoring and reduced stress, words that pressed like a silent verdict against both Adrien and Chinello. The lie they were living had been meant to comfort her. Now it hung in the air like a loaded gun, one wrong move away from disaster. For 2 nights, Chinello refused to leave the hospital. She slept in the chair beside Mama's bed, waking each time the heart monitor beeped in a different rhythm. The nurses grew used to her presence, offering her tea and biscuits during the long hours when nothing moved but the second hand on the wall clock. On the 3rd morning, Mama's eyes opened fully, and she reached for Chinello's hand. "You have the hands of someone who has carried others," she whispered. "Thank you for carrying me." The words lodged deep in Chinello's heart, both a blessing and a blade, because she knew the burden she carried came with the inevitability of losing this bond once the truth surfaced. Across the room, Adrien watched them, something shifting behind his eyes. He had hired Chinello to play a role, but here she was, rooted at his mother's side as though her loyalty had been written into her from birth. It unsettled him. This realization that her presence was no longer part of a calculated arrangement, but something dangerously close to essential. And for the first time since the plan began, he wondered, not as a strategist, but as a son, what would happen to his mother if Chinello disappeared from their lives. Adrien had built his life on control of his time, his business, his image. Emotions were variables he rarely allowed into the equation, preferring outcomes that could be forecasted and managed. But something shifted in him during those days at the hospital. He had been prepared for Chinello to fulfill her duties with competence. He had not been prepared for the unflinching devotion she showed his mother. She didn't merely sit by Mama's bedside. She learned the rhythm of her medications, adjusted pillows when she stirred, read aloud from her favorite devotionals without being asked. And she did it without the performance he had expected. There was no glance over her shoulder to see if he was watching, no subtle reminder of the terms of their contract. She moved as though the role were not an arrangement, but an instinct. One evening, after returning from a business meeting, he found her standing by the window in Mama's hospital room, the faint light from the parking lot tracing the curve of her profile. She was speaking softly, almost to herself, about the importance of not letting the mind dwell in darkness. He stood there longer than necessary, listening without announcing his presence, feeling the edges of his cynicism erode. Back at the estate after Mama was discharged, Adrien began to see Chinello differently. In the breakfast room, where once he had noticed only the precision of her posture, he now saw the quiet efficiency with which she ensured Mama's tea was just the right temperature. On the veranda, he caught her smiling at something Mama said, the warmth in her eyes unforced. The changes in his perception were small at first, a looseness in his own tone when speaking to her, an unplanned compliment on the way she had handled a conversation with a visiting business associate. Then came the moments when he found himself watching her from across a room, the noise of other conversations fading until all he could hear was her laughter. He told himself it was proximity, the inevitable result of sharing a living space. But the truth was harder to ignore. She had slipped past his defenses without even trying, and now he could not quite imagine the house without her presence in it. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He tried to remind himself of the arrangement's boundaries. 3 months, a clean exit, no entanglements. But boundaries drawn on paper have little power against the currents of real connection. He noticed her absence when she left the room, the way the air felt stiller without her. One evening, after Mama retired early, they found themselves alone in the library. The conversation began about something mundane, an upcoming charity auction, but drifted toward more personal terrain. She asked him what his happiest memory as a child had been, and before he could filter his answer, he told her about building a kite with his father, the string cutting into his hands as they ran together. The memory surprised him with its clarity, and he realized he hadn't spoken about his father in years. When she smiled and said softly, "That sounds like freedom," something in his chest tightened. He didn't reply, but when she left the library, he sat in the quiet for a long time, wondering why the thought of her leaving in a few weeks now felt like the wrong kind of loss. The threat came not with the subtlety of rumors, but with the precision of a knife slipped between ribs. Amara had been biding her time, feeding whispers into the right ears, gathering fragments of overheard conversations from people careless enough to speak near her. Then one evening, as she sat in a dim corner of a private lounge, she overheard Bode speaking on the phone. His voice was low, urgent, but she caught enough references to the arrangement, keeping Mama happy, and 3 months. Her mind sharpened around the fragments, like a predator sensing a wounded animal. She didn't need the whole story. She needed only enough to strike at the right moment. By the time she left the lounge, her plan was already crystallizing in her mind. Mama's birthday was coming up, a celebration certain to draw family, friends, and influential figures. It would be the perfect stage for a revelation that would humiliate Adrien and shatter the illusion he had built. In the days that followed, Amara began preparing her script. She knew exactly how to lace her words with just enough truth to make the lie plausible. Chinello, oblivious to the brewing storm, focused on helping Mama plan the celebration, selecting decorations, coordinating with caterers, ensuring that Mama's favorite highlife band would play. The house buzzed with activity, laughter spilling into the corridors as preparations took shape. Adrien, though outwardly calm, sensed something beneath the surface. There was a tension in the air, the faint electric charge that precedes a thunderstorm. He asked Bode directly if anyone outside the family knew of the arrangement. Bode hesitated, a hesitation too brief for most to notice, but enough for Adrien to catch. "No one who matters," Bode replied. It was meant to reassure, but instead it sharpened Adrien's instincts. He began quietly adjusting plans for the party, adding security, altering the guest list, watching for signs of intrusion. On the eve of the celebration, Chinello stayed up late in the kitchen, overseeing the final delivery of desserts. Mama had retired hours earlier, humming to herself about how much she was looking forward to the evening. Adrien came in quietly, leaning against the doorway. "You've done a lot for her," he said, his voice softer than usual. "She deserves it," Chinello replied, brushing sugar from her hands. He studied her for a moment, as though memorizing her in this unguarded state. There was something he wanted to say, but the words stayed locked behind his teeth. Instead, he said, "Tomorrow, just be ready for anything." She frowned, sensing the weight beneath his casual tone, but before she could ask, he was gone. Alone in the kitchen, the scent of vanilla and cocoa heavy in the air, she felt a flicker of unease she couldn't quite name. Somewhere beyond the glow of the kitchen lights, a storm was gathering, and though she didn't yet see it, she could already feel the pull of its wind. The birthday garden looked like something lifted from a dream that had learned good manners. Lanterns strung like tame stars between jacaranda branches, white chairs marching in obedient rows, a high-life band tuning patient horns, while the evening light melted into a soft, forgiving gold. Chinello moved through the preparations with the calm fluency of someone who had decided to be entirely present, making sure the women from Mama's widow support group were seated near the heaters, checking that the pepper soup did not bully the palate, laying a hand on Mama Ifeoma's forearm whenever the older woman tried to be everywhere at once. Mama glowed today, wrapped in deep emerald and threaded gold, the color of leaves that had learned to survive the dry season. Adrien, formal in a navy suit that stole nothing from the night, hovered just near enough to be needed, and just far enough to let his mother reign. When guests rose for tributes, their words braided years into garlands. Stories of school fees paid in secret, of food sent across town without announcement, of prayers that seemed to bruise heaven until it answered. Chinello stood behind Mama's chair, invisible by design, a hand's breadth away from joy that felt like a borrowed shawl warmed by someone else's fire. The band slid into a comforting groove. The cake waited, tall and extravagant as a promise that dared to be believed. And then Amara stepped forward, smile lacquered, glass raised, her voice bright enough to bleach the shadows. "Family," she began. "Tonight we honor a woman whose wisdom could shame kings and whose heart could feed cities." Heads nodded. Even cynics relaxed into the groove of flattery. "May she be blessed, and may the truth always sit at her table," Amara added, and the word truth tilted the evening slightly, like a tray someone had lifted on one side. She held her pause expertly, allowing curiosity to grow legs. "Which is why," she continued, "I must celebrate her most recent blessing, a son finally settled with a wife. We all love a romance, but we love truth more." A murmur, soft as fabric dragging across stone. Adrien's shoulders tightened. Chinello felt the first cool finger of dread slide down her spine. Not yet a hand, just a warning. "So let us toast," Amara said sweetly, turning to Chinello with the affection of a cat. "To the maid who taught a billionaire how to pretend." The word maid detonated without heat, no fire, just a concussive displacement of air that left everyone blinking in a new landscape. For an instant the garden stood still, even the palm fronds held their breath. Then conversations fractured into shards, gasps, whispers, a cough eager to be a sentence. Mama Ifioma turned her face up to Chinello, very slowly, as if careful movement could tame a storm. "What is she saying?" Mama asked, voice level but thin around the edges. And in that thinness lay the history of every unkindness she had ever survived. Chinello opened her mouth and found her throat filled with sand. Across the small distance, Adrien stepped forward, and that step said everything. Mine to answer, mine to carry, mine to fix. "She's lying," he said first, "because the first duty of love, even counterfeit love, is to build a shelter while you figure out where to put the door." Amara laughed a delicate laugh meant for porcelain rooms. "Lying? Oh, Adrien, ask your assistant. Ask the staff who signed her paycheck before she learned to sign Okafor in cursive." A few faces in the crowd turned, hungry for confirmation more than accuracy. The band, confused, let a trumpet whimper into silence. Chinello looked at Mama, and in that gaze there was both surrender and insistence. "I will not let your heart break because I was paid to keep it whole." "Ma," Chinello managed, the single syllable braided with apology and tenderness. "I have served in this house. I did not come as your daughter, but I have loved you like one." The truth, bare unperfumed, entered the night like a woman with dust on her feet who still refused to bow her head. For a heartbeat the garden held both worlds, the one built on careful story, and the one more terrible and more generous, willing to live without disguise. Mama's hand reached for the cane that leaned against her chair, fingers fumbling as if the wood had become a stranger. Her eyes moved from Chinello to Adrien, not accusing, simply asking for alignment in a sky that had shifted its stars. "Is this true?" she asked him, and the quiet around her sentence said that the question itself was heavier than any answer. Adrien opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded, a clean, unweaponized nod, the kind you give when you remember you are your mother's son, before you are the architect of a narrative. "I arranged it," he said, and the admission threaded shame into his voice without cutting away its strength. "I wanted you to rest. I wanted to give you peace." He turned to the guests, to their sympathetic cruelties and their appetites. "This party is over." Security moved, discreet as shadows with training. Amara stepped back, victorious and lonely in the same breath, because triumph isolates. Chinello stayed by Mama, one hand on the older woman's shoulder, and discovered that some loyalties do not need permission to persist after truth has wrecked the furniture. The lanterns still glowed. The cake still stood. But the night had changed its weather. And everyone knew they would measure their lives by before and after this cooling wind called honesty came through and rearranged what deserved to remain. Shock does not shout, it narrows. It took the garden, with its laughing lanterns and polite hedges, and pinched it into a tunnel where only breath and heartbeat mattered. Mama Ifeoma's breath, usually a measured tide, stumbled. Her hand, which had guided Adrien through colds and exams and arrogant seasons, trembled along the cane, missing, finding, missing again. Chinello felt the tremor before she heard the small sound escape Mama's throat, not pain exactly, more like fatigue announcing it had been patient long enough. "Sit, Ma," she urged, lowering the older woman back into the chair, but the chair had become a boat without oars, set adrift on a current that did not consult calendars. Someone fetched water. Someone else summoned the driver. Adrien's voice cut cleanly through the noise. Rare authority stripped of polish, all muscle and urgency. Clear the path. Now. He lifted his mother with that paradox of care and speed learned by men who realized suddenly that wealth is useless against biology. Chinello steadied the other side, their movements synchronized by necessity rather than rehearsal. Guests parted, their expensive perfumes making a confused choir as the trio passed. Amara's face flickered at the edge of vision, then vanished. Even victory cannot bear the intimacy of a hospital corridor, so it prefers distance. The drive to the hospital was a study in throttle time. Lego streets, which normally swaggered with chaos, seemed to lean aside as the car cut through with sirenless purpose. In the back seat, Chinello kept one hand against Mama's wrist and counted. "Steady, steady, please be steady," while Adrien spoke into his phone in the clipped code of men who do not ask for help so much as arrange it. The emergency wards swallowed them under white light, nurses taking the choreography from their hands with professional gentleness. Monitors found their rhythms, for lines threaded fluid into tired veins. A doctor with eyebrows that implied both gravity and competence asked questions Chinello answered faster than Adrien, because she had lived inside Mama's days recently enough to know where the pills were kept and how many sips of water it took to coax them down. When the door closed and the machines took over, silence returned, not emptiness, more like a room waiting to see who would speak first. Adrien leaned against the corridor wall, head bowed for exactly 2 breaths, long enough to confess to himself that he had done this, short enough to remain functional. Boat arrived with paperwork and apologies that had nowhere useful to land. Night in a hospital is an animal that paces. Its claws are the tick of a second hand, its breath the intermittent hiss of oxygen, its gaze the unblinking red digits that mark vital signs, as if life could be condensed into mathematics. Chinello refused the chair and stood, because standing made her believe she could keep vigil without missing anything that needed her. Adrien tried to insist she rest. She looked at him with a patience he did not deserve and said, "When she wakes, I want her to find me standing." So he nodded and stopped telling a woman who had earned her stubbornness where to put it. Hours thinned. The doctor emerged with a diagnosis too careful to comfort. Stress had aggravated what illness already guarded jealously. Rest was not merely wise but imperative. There would be a tomorrow if today behaved. Adrien thanked him in a voice made of wire. When Mama stirred at last, eyes opening like windows tested after rain, she found their silhouettes framed by the monitor's weak glow. "My children," she whispered, and the mercy in that plural was a garment she placed over both without asking which deserved it more. Chinello bent, pressed a kiss against the back of Mama's hand, and felt, for one relieving heartbeat, that love might still be allowed even where permission had lapsed. Outside the window, Legos continued without them, Okadas, laughter, arguments over change. But in this corridor, a son and a woman who was not yet a daughter learned the discipline of waiting, and waiting taught them what speeches never do, how to be small enough to let a heart find its own way home. Morning uncurled itself along the ward in soft, bureaucratic gestures, blood pressure cuffs sighing, footsteps taking attendance on linoleum, sunlight negotiating its admission through blinds. Mama woke fully with a clarity that made the room feel newly swept. She took inventory, the cannula's polite insistence at her nostril, the reliable scold of the heart monitor, the weight of age that had learned to sit quietly at the edge of the bed. Then she looked at her visitors, and the kind of silence that chooses words rather than escapes them settled on all three. Adrien, she said, ordinary syllables, carrying history the way a calabash carries water without leaking. He moved to her side immediately, that particular obedience sons reserve for the women who knew them before power did. I am here, he said, and the boy in his voice surprised them both. Good, she answered. Now tell me what you did, and do not add sugar. The instruction left no clean exits. He did not attempt one. He spoke quietly, stripped of the performative protections that money teaches. How he feared her dying grief more than he respected her living discernment. How he built a house of kindness out of rented bricks. How the lie kept growing flowers until he forgot to check the roots. Each clause laid another tile on a path that could only lead toward confession. Mama listened without interrupting, her thumb rubbing the edge of the blanket as if counting stitches in a fabric someone else had woven. When he finished, the room returned to the metronome of machines. You were a coward, she said at last, the severity softened by the steadiness of her tone. But a coward who wanted to spare me sorrow is still a child I recognize. She turned to Chinello, and the pivot contained no theatrics, only a recalibration toward the person whose presence had become a habit her heart had learned without being asked. And you, she said, you accepted for reasons that were heavy and holy. Poverty is a sharp teacher. It makes saints and liars with the same tool. But you did not lie to me with your hands or your care. Chinello's eyes brimmed, not with argument but with relief, the relief of hearing a truth spoken by the one it could have injured most. I am sorry, she whispered, and the apology wore no perfume, only clean linen. Mama nodded once, as if blessing the simplicity. I am disappointed, she added, looking back to Adrien. But I am not blind. I saw how my soul rested when she read to me. I saw your face become less defended. The world would throw both of you away for your mistakes. I will not. Then came the choice, not a legal pronouncement, not a theatrical forgiveness to be applauded by a choir of relatives, just a decision folded into the next breath. Go and bring her back, Mama said to Adrien, surprising them with the pronoun, because in that moment Chinello was both present and already halfway gone, a woman who would leave rather than let shame eat a home from the inside. Bring her back properly, not as a worker hiding in a story, but as a woman you can stand beside without explanation. If you cannot do that, then let her go honorably, and I will love her loudly anyway. The terms left no space for convenience. Adrien bowed his head, not as a supplicant to wealth, but as a son accepting a sentence designed to make him larger rather than smaller. Yes, Mama, he said, the words functioning less as compliance and more as consent to grow. When the nurse came to check the four, the moment folded itself neatly and waited. Outside the room, Adrien and Chinello walked the corridor like two people learning how to inhabit the same window of time after a hurricane. I was leaving, she admitted softly, not because I wanted to, but because staying felt like stealing. He nodded, because he had already seen the packed neatness in the corners of her eyes. I will come for you, he said, and for once the sentence held no contract beneath it, only a promise that understood it would have to carry itself. Back in the room, Mama closed her eyes, not from fatigue, but from satisfaction, the kind that arrives when you have set two stubborn lives on a road they should have chosen without your older hands, and you decide, finally, to rest while they walk it. The rain had come early that morning, a silver curtain that softened Lagos's usual clamor into something almost contemplative. Adrien's car rolled slowly through narrow streets still slick with water, his eyes scanning for the modest bungalow number Bode had given him. He had not been here before. Chinello's world had existed for him in fragments, stories half told, glimpses stolen from her silences, but now it unfolded in the concrete walls, the faded paint, the corrugated roof patched with care rather than wealth. The car stopped, and for a moment he sat there, his hand resting on the small velvet box in his pocket. This wasn't a boardroom or a gala where he could armor himself with tailored words. This was a threshold that demanded the kind of truth you cannot rehearse. He stepped out, shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth, the air carrying the mingled scent of rain and the faint smoke of someone's breakfast fire. The gate was ajar. Inside the small yard, Chinello knelt beside a plastic basin, wringing out a blanket with the efficiency of someone who had done it all her life. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps, surprise flashing across her face, then something more guarded, an instinctive raising of walls she had spent weeks lowering. "Adrien," she said, not cold, but not welcoming either. He stopped a few paces away, rain still dripping from the fringe of a roof onto the ground between them. "I came for you," he said simply, and the words carried none of the arrogance she had once associated with him. She shook her head slightly, standing and wiping her hands on the wrapper tied around her waist. "You don't need to do this. Mama is safe, she's resting. The arrangement is over." He took a step closer, closing the space with a carefulness she hadn't expected. "The arrangement is over," he agreed. "That's why I'm here, for what's real." Her eyes searched his face for the performance she had learned to spot in men who wanted something from her, but she found none. He told her he had been wrong, not only in how he began their story, but in how he had measured her worth by utility rather than presence. "I thought I was giving my mother peace," he said, "but you gave her joy. And you gave me something I didn't know I needed." His voice was quieter now, and when he reached into his pocket and brought out the small velvet box, her breath caught. He opened it to reveal a ring, not ostentatious, but crafted with a kind of deliberate beauty that spoke of thought rather than display. "Chinello, will you stay? Not because we made a deal, but because I want a life with you in it." For a moment, the rain was the only sound, drumming lightly on tin and leaf. Chinello looked at the ring, then at him, and the memories flickered through her. The first awkward fittings, the dinners where she had been measured by eyes that wanted her to falter, the night in the hospital when Mama had called her daughter, without hesitation. "You think you can just rewrite everything?" she asked, but the edge in her tone was dulled by the tremor in her voice. "No," he said. "I think we can write something new." She laughed then a small, incredulous sound, and pressed a hand to her face. "You've made my life impossible," she murmured, but she didn't step back when he took her hand. "Yes," she said finally, and the word felt both fragile and irrevocable. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit, not like a conclusion, but like the first line of a promise. Behind them, the door opened, and her younger brother, still recovering from surgery, grinned at the sight. Adrien glanced at him, then back at her, and in his expression there was no triumph, only gratitude. The rain eased, the air smelled of wet earth and something new, and for the first time, their story stood without the scaffolding of pretense. The Okafor estate had been transformed, not with the ostentation of wealth, but with the intimacy of an occasion meant for the heart's inner circle. The garden where truths had once collided under lantern light now held a softer arrangement. Tables dressed in ivory linen, vases of white roses, and chairs set in a crescent facing a small platform under the jacaranda tree. Mama Ifioma sat in the front row, a vision of recovered strength in a deep plum wrapper, her cane resting lightly at her side. Guests murmured, their curiosity tempered by the understanding that tonight was not a gala, but a declaration. When Adrien and Chinello emerged from the house, there was a subtle shift in the air. She wore a simple gown the color of dawn, her hair swept into a style that framed her face without hiding its sincerity. The ring on her finger caught the late afternoon light, but it was the look between them that drew the eye, steady, unembellished, a gaze that seemed to acknowledge the road they had taken to get here. Adrien led her to the platform, and for a moment they stood side by side in a silence that was not emptiness, but fullness preparing to speak. Adrien began without notes, his voice carrying across the garden with the ease of a man who had nothing to sell and everything to own. He told them about his mother's wish, about his fear of losing her without fulfilling it, and about the choice he had made that night to find someone to fill a role. He didn't hide the arrangement. Instead, he laid it bare, each sentence a stone placed carefully on the foundation of the truth. "I brought her here under terms that should have kept her at a distance," he said, glancing at Chinello, "but instead, she brought us closer, not through the contract, but through the way she cared for my mother, and, without meaning to, for me." A murmur ran through the crowd, not a scandal, but a recognition for the courage in making an imperfect story public. Tonight, Adrien continued, I'm not asking her to act. I'm asking her to be herself, beside me, for the rest of our lives. He turned to Chinello then, taking her hands, and the noise of the guests faded into the kind of quiet that invites only one answer. Chinello looked out the faces before her, some skeptical, some softened by time, and at the center, Mama Ifeoma's eyes, bright with pride. I came here to help a man give his mother peace, she said, her voice steady despite the swell in her chest. I didn't expect to find a place where I was seen for more than where I came from. Adrien, you've made mistakes, so have I. But I've learned that family isn't always about how it begins. Sometimes, it's about choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave. She nodded once, a small gesture that held the weight of her decision. Yes. The applause rose, warm and unhurried, wrapping around them like a benediction. Mama stood, moving forward with deliberate steps, and embraced Chinello. My true daughter, she said, the words carrying no performance, only truth. The band began to play softly, the jacaranda petals drifted like blessings, and in that moment, Chinello realized this time there was no stage, no script, just the beginning of a story she and Adrien would write without pretending. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.